So I'm very excited about this panel. It is the kind of information you're going to need to make your first steps to becoming a software telco. I've got, I think, some of the brightest minds that I could think of in the industry here, and great experience and lots of different perspective. And I don't want to steal anyone's thunder, so I'm going to let each of my panelists take a minute to introduce themselves. And officially, just so you know, the title of this session is From Legacy to Virtual, the First Steps Toward a Software Telco, and we've got about 45 minutes. So Simon, you want to take it away and give us 60 seconds on yourself and your company?
I sure can. Let me see if I've got this mic working first. Sounds all right, doesn't it? Maybe not. Yes, no.
Can you hear Simon?
Hello. Oh, that's better. Look at that. Apparently you have to turn it on. As you can tell, the Metaswitch brightest mind couldn't show up today. He got sick, so I'm here instead, unfortunately, standing in for him. A very poor standing, as you can tell. I am the Director of Technical Marketing for Metaswitch. I've been at Metaswitch for about 3 years, but I've been in the industry, like a lot of people here, for over 20 now, in lots of different disciplines, anything from engineering through pre-sales and now into the dark side of marketing. And I've been at companies who have really crossed the gambit of technologies, anything from layer 1 optical right up through to network analytics. So I've got the basis covered there. That's me.
Excellent.
Great.
Christos?
Can you hear me? I guess so. All right, good. I'm Christos Kolias with our office in San Francisco with Orange. And I've been working on SDN for about 4 years now. I recently was chairing the working group on wireless and mobile within ONF. I'm also a founding member of HNMV. We started this effort a little bit more than a year ago. So I'm very happy to be involved in that. I'm also the liaison between HNMV and ONF, working on the aspects of SDN and NFV that are complementary.
Hey everybody, I'm Cassidy. I realized I didn't actually introduce myself as far as my background goes. So while I run marketing, I've only been doing this for 3 years. I ran a couple of pure software businesses in Alcatel before that. Before that, my background was operations, so I ran a few global supply chains. I've been a consultant. So one of the things I really like about this mindset of moving to the software industry is, one, because that's my background, and two, there's a lot of operational constructs that go into what we're trying to achieve with regard to lean and agile and cycle time reduction and taking waste out of what we do. And so very passionate about that. Look forward to the dialogue.
So I've got a number of questions myself, but I also want to open this up to the audience. We've got the perspective of hardware / emerging software companies, as well as Telco up here, obviously, on the stage. So if you have questions, just raise your hand. I'll call on you and hopefully get everything answered that you want to know about. So I'll kick it off. And the first question is about virtualization and the cloud. Is virtualization the same as the cloud, or are they mutually exclusive? Who wants to take that one?
I can take a stab at it if you want. To get things rolling. And I'll really build off, I think, our experience with developing a session border controller, as we started to do about 3 years ago. We designed our session border controller to be completely decoupled, software-based products, completely decoupled from any underlying hardware. So on the step towards virtualization, that's sort of the first thing that you have to do. And you have to obviously leverage all the good things that you get in general purpose computing platforms these days. High amount of processing power based on the number of the cores are there. The ability to replace custom hardware components such as TCAMs and crypto chips and DSPs with things like layer 3 cache. So I can use layer 3 cache in the CPU to really effectively replace a TCAM. To replace a TCAM these days for fast lookups. I can do things closer to the Linux kernel to replace things like network processors. They're prevalent in SBCs today. And I can rely on next generation codecs like Opus and Silk to alleviate the need for DSPs. So that's the first thing you got to do towards virtualization. In terms of virtualization itself, there's a couple of different angles you can look at, I think. The first is you can obviously do quick, simple, down and dirty virtualization using techniques like device partitioning, SR, IOV, single route IO virtualization. Now, what that enables you to do, it enables you to get near bare metal performance, but in a virtualized environment. What that basically means is that you use direct memory access techniques, DMA techniques, using basically hardware components built into like an Intel NIC to write data straight from the network interface card, the NIC, directly into user space of the OS. Right, so that's virtualization. I can virtualize a platform in that way very, very quickly and easily and with high performance. The problem is there I can't use a vSwitch in that environment. So with SR-IOV, no vSwitch, no management capabilities. So if I want a vSwitch on the road to obviously NFV, I need that vSwitch in there to provide that management capability. I can't use SR-IOV, so my performance is going to dramatically decrease. So then we've got to look at other ways to perform acceleration. And we can look at DPDK in that case to perform a level of acceleration. That's obviously Intel's data plane development kit. So with DPDK, we can actually accelerate the data from the NIC again into the user space memory. It does that through things like POLD DMA, big FIFO buffers, zero copy. Obviously, zero copy rather than copying the data once or twice before it gets from the NIC to the user space. It goes straight into the user space, and away you go. Now that's obviously been performed by people like Six Wingate. They actually take DPDK base and then obviously build on that with to really accelerate the vSwitch hardware. Because you've got the vSwitch in there, you can have management and capabilities now, so you're getting towards NFV. And of course, the third step is, well, I say, the cloud now for virtualization, automatic scale up, scale down, elastic scaling of services on demand. And that's really where I think you get to a full cloud capability at that point.
Thank you. Anyone else want to tackle that?
Yeah, so I think in my mind, cloud and virtualization are not exactly synonymous. So we have to acknowledge that actually cloud exists before virtualization. When you look at things like email, that like Hotmail or Google Mail later on, these are already existing in the cloud somehow, right? And even Facebook today, which we think is like a cloud company, they don't necessarily use virtualization for their production network. But we have to recognize that cloud can certainly leverage the virtualization because it makes sense operational-wise to do that. So I would think that virtualization is towards the path to cloud, whether it's storage, compute, or network. And network virtualization is something, it's a theme that has actually surfaced over the last 2 or 3 years, for that matter. So it depends exactly, what's your environment. If you're talking about cloud operations across the globe or that span over a geographic, over the geography, then you definitely need virtualization to essentially, build that virtual data center. But you don't need one for the other, at least in my mind.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit, let's take a different slant. So I agree with they're not the same. So when I talk to our product managers, I try to dumb it down. And I say, from a virtualization perspective, you need to tell me what hardware you're going to run on, or can I just sell your software? Because that's the question we're getting asked from our customers. Don't tell me about hardware. Don't tell me about infrastructure. Just sell me your software. I'll decide what it runs on. You give me your SLA. So if you can do that, then I think you're virtualized. And there's a bunch of techniques to optimize that, which were discussed here. On the cloud side is, can I install your software, and can it scale on its own? Can it self-heal? Can it run in an automated fashion? Are you there yet? And so when I think of cloud, I think automation. When I think virtualization, I think hardware independency. And that's kind of the black and white that we, obviously there's shades of gray in between when we're working with customers and roadmaps. But when we try to set, with our product managers, what are the goals, that's how we separate the two.
So Cassidy, you made a comment earlier on about the differences between a data center and a telco data center and scale, and you talked to that a little bit, and that got me thinking about hypervisors. And do carriers have different needs in terms of hypervisor selection, or is it the same as a traditional data center? And what should a software telco be looking at?
Comes up a lot. So be interested to see what other people say. We see a dominant move towards using open source environments, so KVM and OpenStack. We see very few customers, and I actually can only think of one offhand, that's insisting on a VMware environment for what I would call a carrier cloud data center. So a lot of our conversations are either, the OpenStack, KVM, a little bit of CloudStack kind of construct, very little on VMware, which is very different than what they might be doing in their IT internal data center today. Whether that remains that way or not, I think it will. So from our perspective, we're pushing very heavily on open source, cloud management layer, and at the hypervisor, and everywhere else we can.
From a, I think from a hypervisor perspective, we ignore the layers above there for now. The right answer could be whatever one you're using right now. I mean, again, it depends what level of virtualization you're doing, of course, as discussed previously. But if you're using VMware right now, off you go. VMware it is. If you talk to the NFV guys, most of them, as I understand, Christos, you'd be able to confirm this, are running KVM. They're saying KVM is the way to go. Obviously, there are other couple of options, Hyper-V and Zen, but out of sort of those 4 or 5, it's, again, KVM, I think, from NFV, and if you're using VMware, off you go. Carry on with VMware.
I mean, I think we prefer to be hardware agnostic at this point. So, and then when we start looking into NFV, and we published the white paper a year ago, and I want to clear that is when we're talking about virtualization, we don't really necessarily mean that you have to use VMs, right? Virtual machines. We're talking about how you can move actually hardware into software. That's the call for virtualization. And if you look again at the white paper, it says how you can leverage commodity IT servers. So we don't even say that you have to use VMs, and we don't even say that you have to use x86-based architectures to do that. So we're kind of open. But the telco data center is definitely different from other traditional data centers that Amazon or Google or Facebook has, because simply due to the fact that we have different requirements when it comes to regulatory things or it comes to SLAs and things like that. So we're kind of different. But I prefer that we stay agnostic in the sense of what's the hardware selection. But we're, of course, as Orange, we're big on VMware. We're partners of VMware. So obviously, we're using VMware. And so, but the different application, when you look at OSS and BSS type of applications, obviously, you have to use some commercial type of software.
Where do you start as a carrier? What are the first steps that you should take to embarking upon a software future?
So from my perspective, the thing that we are doing today is working on proof of concepts. That's the first step, right? You start with something. You start working with some software players. It could be someone who is like a well-known incumbent in the industry, or maybe a startup. So this is a perfect opportunity for us to essentially test the waters and see, what really makes sense for us. As was mentioned before, AT&T has announced that Domain 2.0 program where they're opening up essentially their, they're opening up to different vendors, and it doesn't have to be, someone who's well established in the industry. So for us, again, we're starting exploring different avenues with respect to NFV. In our office in San Francisco, we're working on virtualizing the EPC on VEPC. We think this is very, very exciting for us, especially it makes sense when you're going to new markets where there's less infrastructure. We call these greenfield type of environments. We are expanding in Africa, for instance. So sometimes you don't want to rely on existing infrastructure. So obviously these things could become really, really useful. And so we start with a POC and see, trying to do like a technical feasibility first. And then the second thing is performance, right? Can that thing scale? Can it handle the type of traffic that we would like to handle, right? So, but if you're looking at places like Africa, maybe scalability is not the first challenge there. So we are aware of that. But again, the first step is to do the technical feasibility, make sense, figure out that it makes sense to pursue that, and then look at the management orchestration tools that we need to put on top of that, and other types of applications like voice over IP, for instance, and IMS. So I think it's more like a stepwise type of process. We're starting like again with new architectures. And the interesting thing about NFV, as we are talking to different startups, is that, and as is specific to VPC, is that they don't necessarily try to replicate the existing infrastructure. So they replicate the functionality, but you don't have to replicate the boxes that exist today in the network. So that's what we find quite interesting, to be honest. And actually, this is also my own personal vision, how we can remove most of the complexity that today exists in some of the architectures.
So as you're evolving your network, you have to rethink things because the segmented ways of purchasing in the past, which was very box-oriented, goes away, and now you have to try to figure out how to tie together cohesive solutions.
Right.
Now, how does multi-vendor play into that?
How does it play in terms
Multi-vendor in terms of you've got a few vendors here with you, and,
Right.
and I mean, this is actually, I like to think of this as the future, right? You've got the ability to mix and match more vendors as you go forward. How does that work?
So for us, it's important when we talk to different vendors that they have partnerships. So they have already tested the kind of platforms that we'd like to implement in our test bed or in our lab, and hopefully in our production network later, is that they have already tested those things, themselves. So, and I don't want to disclose any names, but we've been working with a number of vendors, and actually when we talk to them and say, hey, by the way, there's this other vendor that they're also working with us, providing essentially a turnkey type of solution.
So that's important for the vendors in the room, that make sure that you
it's
guys
important for us as
exchange
well, right?
business
Yes.
cards, because you may
Yeah.
find some deals falling in your lap or validated because you're working with some of the other people in this room.
And actually, within NFV, we have announced that POCA framework, and the requirement there is that you have an operator and minimum two vendors working together building the POC. So this is very, very important, to work with the industry on that.
So I had a conversation recently with someone from Cisco who's going to be speaking a little bit later today or tomorrow. And what he said to me really got me thinking about what could happen to this market. And that is that if the hardware is commoditized and we're pure software, then will the carrier of the future look for the most efficient software? In other words, if I have an SBC and another company has an SBC that runs on less CPUs or less cores, is that how we're going to judge the carriers or the solutions providers in the future based upon how efficient their software is? Is that something that they should be taking into account?
Yeah, I mean, this certainly is going to be one of the metrics. Performance is definitely one of the metrics, but also cost is going to be another significant metric, right? Because we're saying that, okay, we're going to save on CapEx and OpEx, but we have to realize actually there's a shift from CapEx to OpEx, right? And we're trying to visualize, I should say, network hardware, because at the end of the day, as you move those functions into software, you need to buy more servers, right? Obviously. So it's not really clear yet, how much of that CapEx thing we're going to see. And when it comes to OpEx, we recognize there's going to be some savings there, but you have to, spend money on buying the licenses, right? And if you look at VMware today, for instance, or other vendors, these licenses don't really come cheap. So I would definitely say efficiency and how you can scale things and how you can, how fast you can react to certain things. So, if you see like a traffic spike in a network and you want to deploy more resources, so agility is going to be part of that equation, but also cost and ease of integration and things like that. So, but definitely efficiency and performance is big, and be able also to preserve the SLIs. This is very, very important to us as a telco. We're very big on promising and trying to fall through when it comes to SLIs.
I'd imagine if, obviously not all SBCs are built equally, if one is chucking up more statistics to a VNF manager or the orchestration element of an NFV environment, obviously that gives the orchestrator more granular ability to spin up and turn down that component on demand as well. Obviously would greatly save on costs as well if you're limiting or only spinning up resources as and when they're required.
I'd add something to that. I think the characteristics of why you buy don't necessarily change, but what is actually being bought fundamentally changes, right? So if I'm a vendor today, and I'm a legacy vendor like a Cisco or a Ericsson or Alcatel-Lucent, I mean, I'm selling an integrated system of hardware and software. So my capabilities are, I'm a strong hardware vendor, strong software vendor. I've tightly coupled these things together to make this thing reliable, quality, scale, et cetera. The future, I'm going to be measured on how good of a software developer I am. So can I still deliver similar types of characteristics, but I have to be really, really good at software development. I can't rely on underlying infrastructure. So while a customer will still want quality, reliability, price, et cetera, the fundamentally what they're measuring is going to be different. It's going to be based on your ability to build telecom software, not your ability to integrate software and hardware together. And you could see a shift. So if you see vendors who don't embrace that and are kind of still stuck in the past, you could see a big shift in the vendor landscape around that.
And I should mention, Cassidy, I mean, you talk about your company as a legacy vendor and, from the good old days, and that certainly is the case, but when I was covering the voice over IP market earlier in the 90s, there were a few years where you had some challenges in terms of seeing new vendors coming onto the scene, like Sonus and a bunch of others, that really threatened your survival or well-being. And you adjusted very quickly, and I think it was IPX you came out with. There are a number of products you came out with in the 90s. My memory is kind of failing, but you reacted fairly quickly and with a strong voice that you were going to be leaders in IP. And so the point is that you're right that some vendors from today may not make it through, but at the same time, you've already, as a company, demonstrated that you were able to make that leap and do it well.
Yeah, we're all in. I mean, we had a bunch of analysts together last week, and it was all about cloud and NFV. This is what we're doing. Hell or high water, this is the move we're going to make as a company. We love it, right? Because, yeah, you have to be really good at software, but you need to know telecom. So what's the legacy give us? The ability to understand telecom, right? So we're confident we can be really good software developers as well, and we think the two combinations are powerful for those who embrace it.
So I'm just going to open up just in case there are any questions. Anyone have anything? Yes, sir.
So this is for Christos. Christos talked about the need for the vendors to partner with themselves and come with integrated solutions. And my question is, obviously some activity is going on in that area, but are the operators or maybe you all in particular, making an attempt to provide them with some sort of use cases or something that would guide the vendors as to what they ought to partner on? I mean, otherwise, as we know in these kind of new areas, there's a lot of flux that happens in the industry, which probably will happen now. But I'm wondering if, since that is what the operators are looking for, what support are the operators providing to help the vendors build those kind of partnerships which come up with solutions that you actually need?
Right. So within HNMV, we recently published a number of specifications that essentially set the stage, set the framework of what we're looking in terms of requirements. So obviously, they have to fall in with that specific framework. So we work with them to say, okay, this is what we want to do. This is how we need to, this is how we'd like to be done. And then, but it's up to them to say, I've worked with this particular other vendor, and we have this this solution. And I think the keynote speakers mentioned the importance of management orchestration. So in our mind, this is the most critical thing when it comes to NFV. So if you're a vendor working on I don't know, virtualizing CDN, then you need to find someone who can actually provide also the management orchestration side of things. Because at the end of the day, we have to build an integrated solution. So that's very important to us. So that's very, very key.
And then one related question, Rich, if I may.
Please.
We talked about, okay, what is going to be virtualized, and the EPC came up quite often in the talks that people gave. What the question there is, we talk about functionality versus the architecture of the way the infrastructure is laid out today. So do you see, there are two ways, there are many ways to virtualize, but one is that you start virtualizing the infrastructure, the other is you think of the EPC
Right.
as a bunch of functions,
Right.
and the architecture itself changes fundamentally.
Yep.
So which of these do you all at the panel think we're going to go? And EPC does seem to have a very big push towards virtualization nowadays, so it'd be nice to get your opinions on that. Would that be one of the first use cases for it?
I'll let the vendors go first, and then I'll add my observations.
It's a good question. I think what we'll see is a slight combination to begin with. Meaning, if you've never built an EPC and you're starting from scratch, well, then you're going to build it fundamentally different, right? If you're taking software that you've built in the past and you've evolved it, and that software's been kind of built around modules, then that's going to take time to get that to look differently. What I can say about our EPC is that we will ensure we do it right. It will be completely hardware independent, tied into management and orchestration where appropriate. And I think from an approach of how we take it to market is good as well. And that is, and this is maybe good for the vendor community at large, and that is, it doesn't need to be on day one the exact replacement. So you don't need to take your tried and true EPC out of your catalog and put the virtual one in, right? So we'll come out and we'll say, here's EPC conceptual, EPC or IMS, I know both. Here's EPC 1.0 in the cloud. It has these characteristics, and we can do this with it today, and there's a roadmap to make it better. If you want your big 5.9, 6.9s, proprietary kind of chipset, own DSP, all this, here's that solution, right? So you have a range of things that you can pick from as a vendor, and you can decide where you want to start, and we'll have an evolution path. And I think for vendors who are coming from an environment where they have something today and they're moving that to the cloud, it's a very prudent way to do it versus trying to say, today I'm, traditional, and tomorrow I'm only selling, virtual.
From our perspective, Metaswitch, obviously we developed Project Clearwater and released it to the open source community because we felt the IMS core was low-hanging fruit, right, for virtualization. And certainly we continue to believe that, as I believe the NFV community generally believe, in terms of early use cases for virtualization, IMS is right up there in the sort of top 6 or 8, as I believe there are now. Of course, when we talk about an IMS core as a virtual network function, it allows us the ability to talk a bit more about the nuances of NFV. Of course, the IMS core is actually made up of multiple different components. You think of it as a PCSCF, SCSF, ICSCF, breakout gateway control function, for example, as the sort of the top players there. So, of course, what we do in NFV parlance is we talk about those as individual virtualized network function components. And from an NFV perspective, there's VNFCs, and each of those VNFCs have standard interfaces, diameter and sort of SIP in this case, in the case of an IMS core. And then NFV says, okay, now we're going to take those individual VNFCs, let's say it's an ICSCF and an SCSCF, and we're going to group them together as a package. And from that package, we're going to expose, again, another set of standard interfaces and that is obviously SIP and diameter in that case. And this package is basically a combination of those VNFCs in what the NFV calls a service graph. So it takes VNFCs, creates a service graph, creates a package, and it's that package that we ultimately care about as the virtualized network function. And of course, taking it one step further, which is what the IETF are looking at now, is a way to take those packages and develop service function chains. And that's the ability to say, okay, I'm delivering an IMS service now, and an IMS service, not just the IMS core, it could be a session border controller to the left of it, and it could be charging and policy and charging functions to the right of it. So the IETF is saying, okay, take those service function graphs, service forwarding graphs, and create a service function chain based on the SBC, the IMS core package, and then the policy and charging functions as well.
So, and from my perspective, is we like to see some like out-of-the-box thinking, how you can remove some of the complexity that today exists in some of these architectures. So again, we're really interested in the functionality. So if you want to look at it as a black box, and maybe it's not a black box because these things are adhering to standards, but again, we see how you can remove the complexity. Not only that, and the reason we want to do that is because we may want to insert new functions into that architecture. Like for instance, putting on my SDN hat now, we're working on an SDN-based solution on for traffic offloading, for instance, right? So if today I want to put that into my architecture, I have to go to one of my partners, to one of my vendors, and say, hey, I have this great idea of implementing traffic offloading. Can you please put that into your box? So there's going to be a process there, right? But now that things are becoming softwareized, then that might be easier to do. I can go to another vendor and say, how we can, implement that in software and essentially integrate that into the platform. So I think for me, that's what's really important, to open it up. And if you look at the white paper that we published like last year, we have a Venn diagram of three intersecting circles. One of them is NFV, of course. The other one is SDN. And the third one is the open innovation. And we are very much keen on that aspect as well. And I believe that the next panel is going to be talking about SDN and NFV, so there's no need for me to elaborate on that.
And we have another panel coming up right now, so if I could have you all give the panel a hand. Great job.